So thank you everyone that has already joined. We will go ahead and start. For those that do not know me, my name is Katuchi Kasandi, and I'm a program associate with Andy in East Africa. And this is the outline of the webinar today. So please note, I would I'd want to do like just one announcement is that all through the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to type in the question field, and then during the Q&A session later on in the webinar, we will respond to your questions accordingly. So you've noticed that there are a couple of non-members that have joined the call, and they wanted to take the first few minutes to introduce them to Andy. So Andy is an acronym that stands for the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. We are a global network of around 290 organizations, and all these organizations within our network do support entrepreneurship in some shape or form. So some of our members support entrepreneurship, but by providing financial support, and others provide non-financial support to small and growing businesses. And this is with the conviction that these small and growing businesses are going to they are going to create jobs. They are going to lead to long-term economic development. They are going to produce social and environmental benefits, and ultimately lead to sustainable development in emerging markets. And Andy, one of the things that you'll consistently hear in our meetings is this category of business that we refer to as small and growing businesses. And for us, our small and growing businesses are commercially viable businesses that have the following characteristics. So they have in between 5 to 250 employees. They seek that amount of growth capital. And more importantly, they are usually too large to be categorized under micro enterprises, but at the same time too small and risky to benefit from traditional commercial capital. So all our members are actually committed to closing the gaps that SGBs face. And this is because SGBs have over the years proven to be engines of prosperity in emerging markets. And therefore, if you have joined this call and you're not an Andy member and you are actually interested to be a part of a network that supports these kinds of businesses, feel free to reach out to me after this call, and I'll be happy to share more about the membership. Onto the agenda of the day, we thought like it should be very good for us to start with sharing what an entrepreneurial ecosystem is before we get into the presentation. And when we think about an entrepreneurial ecosystem, we are thinking about just think about the factors that constitute the environment in which entrepreneurs operate in. So like the ones that are already listed on the slide that is in front of you. And together, all of these factors make an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So at Andy, we believe that entrepreneurship programs that take an entrepreneurial ecosystem approach tend to be the most effective ones. Unfortunately, for a very long time, we had not gotten the opportunity to test this hypothesis or this belief until in 2017. Where Andy, together with like-minded funders, that is the Dutch Good Growth Fund, Small Foundation, as well as Argidius Foundation, came to, and we had other partners, that was the Swiss Development Corporation, USAID, and Shell Foundation, who came together to develop the Uganda Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Initiative. And for us, generally, the Ugandan Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Initiative is a two-phased process. And phase one, which is what we'll be discussing a lot today, is a diagnostic phase, and the consultants will be sharing the findings that they got from diagnosing the Uganda entrepreneurial ecosystem. And then the second phase is supposed to be an implementation phase. And towards the end of this call, we are going to share what are the next steps for this project. And before I invite the consultants, I just wanted to highlight that to us as Andy, Uganda presented a very good place for us to test this model for a couple of reasons. First of all, because the funders that were coming on board all actually do fund initiatives in Uganda. But secondly, the other thing was that Uganda is ranked as one of the most one of the most entrepreneurial country in the world by the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, and this is based on the number of startups and the percentage of the population that own businesses in that market. And again, based on our experience in Uganda, we just realized, like, despite this being the case, there are also a couple of challenges around talent, access to finance, access to markets that these small and growing businesses that were facing, because a lot of them were not getting past the age of 2 years. And therefore, as Andy, we wanted to understand what is it about Uganda that makes it a place where a lot of the population are able to start businesses, and what are some of these bottlenecks that exist that are hindering these businesses from graduating from small and growing, from livelihood sustaining businesses to become, like small and growing businesses. And it is to this end that we commissioned the Uganda Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Initiative. And at this point in time, before I invite the consultants to go ahead and start sharing the findings from the initiative, I'd like to share a brief bio of the consultant. And the lead consultant for this project was Max Walter. And Max Walter is the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Development Alternatives in Uganda. He has led CDA research on energy, labor markets, entrepreneurship, and economic transformation. Max led the UEI Phase I team and developed its methodology. Previously, he worked in Congo as a program manager and technical advisor on DFID's largest market systems development program globally. He has a background in the politics and economics of development, with degrees obtained from the University of York and the London School of Economics. And the second speaker of today is Ronald Mukasa, who was also one of the consultants in the UEI project. And Ronald Mukasa is a business development manager and program manager with Enterprise Uganda, where he co-leads the business development agenda. Ronald has participated in the conceptualization, design, and implementation of several entrepreneurial programs with a focus of youth, women, and agro-based entrepreneurs. He recently led the Strengthen Women Entrepreneurs program and was a lead consultant on the UEI Phase I team. As a speaker on entrepreneurship, Ronald has been featured on Uganda's leading television stations, offering advice to Uganda entrepreneurs. Ronald has obtained a Bachelor's of Statistics with honors from the Makerere University and an MSc in Development Management from the London School of Economics. Without much further ado, I'd like to welcome Max and Ronald to take it away. So Max, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Katuchi. And thanks for everyone for joining. I am just trying to share my presentation with you. So I hope you can all see this and hear me well. Great. First of all, maybe we could just very briefly introduce the organization. So I run the Center for Development Alternatives, which is a Kampala-based think tank that has the aim to foster homegrown ideas for East African economic transformation. So understanding what's stopping small and growing firms from growing and creating more jobs is really at the core of what we do.
And Enterprise Uganda focuses on supporting small and medium enterprises within the country to grow and expand and achieve their business goals. So we do training, we do business mentoring and business counseling, and a lot of business development services to support small and medium enterprises. We've been doing this for about 17 years now in Uganda, and we have had the opportunity of interacting with a number of entrepreneurs who are currently brand names within the country.
So what we'll do is I'll briefly talk about the study as a whole and our methodology. I'll then speak about our findings and recommendations in Kampala, and Ronald will head to Gulu to give you the findings and recommendations from there. So maybe just a little bit of context, because some of you might not be in Uganda or very familiar with it. One of the big questions that CDA grapples with is why it is that Uganda has seen high growth over the last few decades, but very limited structural transformation. So the growth that is being experienced is largely jobless. It's not leading to decent employment at scale. And as a result of that, today most Ugandans work either on smallholder farms or in micro household enterprises. And these micro enterprises tend to be informal. They tend to create low pay, low quality, and low productivity jobs. an interesting statistic to highlight that is that even in the formal sector, so even registered firms, the average firm size in Uganda has about 2 employees. So that kind of clearly shows that self-employment and micro-enterprise is still the dominant form of employment. So we're trying to understand small and growing businesses, which Katuchi briefly introduced, and the data on firm size and firm growth rates is not readily available, but our rough estimate is that if we use Andy's definition of SGBs, there are probably less than 8,000 of those firms in Uganda. And just a bit of context on the 2 areas of study. So we focus on Kampala and Gulu. Kampala because it's clearly the dominant location in Uganda's economy. It's home to more than half of Uganda's manufacturing and about a third of registered firms, and has a huge impact on the rest of the country. And Gulu we focused on because it has a much stronger link to the rural economy. Being in northern Uganda, it's got a population of about 100 to 150,000, and is very linked to what used to be the breadbasket of Uganda and maybe even the region. So it's got a lot of untapped agricultural potential, which is why it's an interesting region. Okay, so I'll briefly talk about our methodology, then our findings, and then the recommendations. So as Katuchi explained, the idea with UEI was to use an integrated analytical framework that looks at the entire ecosystem in which entrepreneurs operate. We actually partnered with Koltai & Company. They were part of the consortium, and Stephen Koltai developed this analytical framework. So very briefly, it looks at 6 activity domains in the ecosystem and 6 actor types. So the actor types are basically everyone. I mean, all kinds of organizations have some role to play. And running very briefly through the domains, we can start with identify at the top, which is about how entrepreneurs are supported in identifying new business opportunities and how promising entrepreneurs are identified by the ecosystem stakeholders. Next is train. So this is about the kind of structured and formal training that entrepreneurs receive to be able to better run and grow their businesses. Connect and sustain is really 2 things. So the connect side is about support for entrepreneurs to connect to each other and to mentors and to all sorts of other players. And sustain is really what we refer to as business development services, so tailored support to help sustain the growth of businesses. Fund is pretty self-explanatory, and it covers all kinds and sources of funding for businesses. And public policy, the same. So this covers rules and regulations and government actors. And finally, celebrate, which is all about how entrepreneurship is celebrated in the media and in society more generally, and to inspire up-and-coming entrepreneurs or people who aren't yet entrepreneurs to become entrepreneurs. So this is the framework we applied to try and understand what's going on in Kampala and in Gulu and where the gaps and opportunities are. Our methodology, maybe I should go to the next slide first, actually. So this is what we did to collect information. Over the last 8 months or so, we carried out a literature review, we carried out a firm study with 168 small and growing businesses in Kampala and Gulu to get their perspectives essentially on where they see the biggest strengths and weaknesses. A number of stakeholder interviews with actors from all throughout this 6+6 framework, focus group discussions with entrepreneurs and with stakeholders, and a bunch of workshops to kind of validate the findings and to design together with the stakeholders some of the recommendations that we have. And essentially what we did in all of these forms of data collection was to start with one big question, which is what's holding back SGBs in Kampala and Gulu from growing? And you can ask that question and you get the same few responses, usually access to finance, access to skills, etc. But what we tried to do was dig a little bit deeper. So we applied something called root cause analysis, or the 5 whys, in which you essentially get the first answer to the question and then keep asking why, and the result is a sort of issue tree that maps out the more proximate and more underlying causes. So just as an illustration of what that kind of yielded, this is what we like to call the spaghetti bowl. So this is a pretty complex kind of issue tree of the responses that we received from all the different types of data we collected. And although this is obviously pretty unhelpful in terms of presenting the findings in a concise way, it did help us to sort of map, what are the most commonly cited constraints on business growth, and what are the underlying reasons, and how do they all kind of fit together. So I'm going to attempt to summarize this a little bit later on. Just a quick word about Kampala's SGBs. So from our firm survey, and this is pretty much corroborated by the existing literature, we found a few interesting things about the entrepreneurs that run SGBs in Kampala. First of all, they tend to be relatively well educated. You can see that over 70% of them have a university degree, and over 20% have some other tertiary degree. They tend to be a little bit older, and they tend to, so the average age I think was 35, and they tend to be relatively well experienced, at least in running a business. So that kind of goes a little bit against some of the dominant narrative, at least here, which is that the youth need to be supported in setting up enterprises, because the enterprises that are actually growing to a decent size tend to be managed by more experienced and better educated and slightly older people. And the other interesting thing was to look at the sectors in which SGBs, so firms that actually meet the SGB criteria, operate in. It pretty much reflects the rest of the economy. So trade, so this is largely retail trade and small scale dominates, and education, health, and social sciences is in second place. Okay. Now, we had a lot of discussions about how to segment the SGB group, because obviously not all SGBs are the same. And there's very little sort of literature to draw on in terms of how you can empirically group SGBs into different segments, although a lot of interesting work has been done to create different conceptual categories. But we tried to look at the actual figures. So this is a graph that shows on the x-axis annual turnover, which is a proxy for size, and on the y-axis the compound annual growth rate in turnover. So that's kind of showing the smaller versus larger firms, and the slow growth versus fast growth firms. And you can see that obviously a lot of them are concentrated towards the lower end of annual turnover, so mostly below $100,000 annually. And a huge range in growth rates, which has to inform the recommendations, because a firm that's growing 80% a year definitely needs different kind of support to a firm growing 5%. Okay, a quick snapshot of the Kampala ecosystem. So this is sort of a very crude way of representing the results that we found from 3 different forms of data we collected. I won't go into much detail, but it's pretty clear to see that fund and enable, so public policy, the regulatory environment, and the access to finance are the areas that most people cite as the major constraints. From our firm survey, so again, we surveyed 168 SGBs in Kampala, in Kampala and Gulu, about 110 of them were in Kampala. These are the top 3 strengths and weaknesses they mentioned. So interesting to see large domestic demand. So clearly there's a feeling among entrepreneurs that there's a lot of untapped potential in the economy. Family support, cultural beliefs, so this kind of feeds into the celebrate segment of the ecosystem, is perceived as relatively strong. And it's relatively easy to start a business. And on the other hand, we have the top constraints, and I think this is very telling. There's nothing really about finance or skills or anything else here. It's really all quite public sector driven. So tax rates, tax administration, corruption, and both of those two things, as I'll go into a little bit later, contribute to weak trust in the business community. So really the core of the report, and I'm only going to give a little bit of a snapshot here because there's so little time. The core of the report is this image of the interrelated binding constraints that we found. So these are the issues that are affecting the growth of small businesses the most, and they're all interrelated, and all of them have a direct impact on businesses, and almost all of them have an indirect impact, which is kind of represented by the arrows here. So they reinforce each other. So I'll very quickly run through these, and this is for Kampala. So right at the top, we have the financial constraints. On the left hand, moderate growth SGBs tend not to qualify for private investment or impact investment because they just don't produce the kind of relatively quick returns that those investors are looking for, which means that they need to be catered to by other forms of finance. And perhaps the most promising of those are banks, supply chain partners, and alternative finance providers. The constraints that we kept hearing, I mean, they're pretty unsurprising. Most SGBs are effectively excluded from this type of financing, especially from bank financing, as a result of the very high interest rates, strict collateral requirements, and complicated procedures that banks apply that the SGBs are just not able to meet. And this kind of is linked to a bunch of other issues that I'll go into. On the other hand, we have finance for high growth SGBs. And here, the major constraint that we kept coming across was that there are a number of investors. There are many impact investors around in Kampala already. Most of them are financed by development finance institutions and philanthropic money. But they tend to miss out on the biggest segment of SGBs, and overwhelmingly the kind of ticket size of funding that SGBs in Kampala are looking for is below $100,000. And that's exactly the range in which it becomes extremely difficult for investors to amortize all the transaction costs, the business development services cost, and all the risk that's associated with those small businesses. So most of those investors, even the impact investors, tend to focus on higher ticket sizes, starting from $200,000-300,000 and up, and very few small actors are serving those below 100,000. And to add to that, impact investors tend to focus on impact businesses, and there's a tendency, although this is not always true, there's a tendency that those focusing on the smallest businesses tend to have the strictest or narrowest focus or definition of what impact means to them. So the USAID PACE program found some interesting results throughout East Africa, but especially in Uganda, to show that I think it was more than half of the businesses that were turned away from funding. It was because they were either in the wrong sector or they didn't have enough impact or not the right kind of impact. So this kind of shows that the investors that are operating at this lower end of the spectrum are not serving the majority of the market. As we move a little bit deeper down into the underlying causes, we see early stage BDS, so early stage business development services, is not commercially viable for many of the same reasons I just cited with finance. So business development services provided to businesses that are in the range of looking for funding below $300,000 or so tend to leverage some kind of grant funding because it's just not commercially viable to do it without any grant funding. And as a result of that, there's a lot of that BDS tends to be short-lived, and there's just not a lot of it. So the accelerators and the investors that are providing it tend to focus on a small number of potential investees. Enterprise Uganda is actually an interesting example, maybe the only organization that focuses on BDS to a very large number of businesses in Uganda. So related to that, there's a vicious cycle between weak records, the tax burden, and informality. When you ask, sorry, 1 second. When you ask banks, for example, why they're not funding a lot of SGBs, the lack of strong financial records tends to be the #1 response. And the lack of strong financial records is intimately linked to informal practices, which are partly culturally driven, but also very connected to tax. So let me focus on tax for a minute. The corporate income tax rate in Uganda is 30%, which is comparable to a lot of countries in the region. The problem is that 95% of companies in Uganda are competing with informal companies. So if I'm being taxed at 30% and my competitor down the road is not paying that tax, I'm at a severe disadvantage in terms of competitiveness. On top of that, there's a perception that the Uganda Revenue Authority harasses small businesses rather than support them. As a result of weak financial records, a lot of the time that businesses are taxed, it's based on its presumptive tax. So because the businesses don't have proper records, the tax collector goes in and makes an assumption. And that opens the door for corruption, and it usually opens the door for harsh treatment of small businesses that might not even be making a profit at all. So there's a real conundrum here, and the fact that small businesses are so scared of the tax burden reinforces the fact that they don't have strong financial records. Essentially, a lot of weak financial records is actually linked to tax avoidance, because there's a paranoia about having proper books and people seeing those financial books. Oops, sorry. These constraints are linked to a lack of strong management skills. So this goes back to financial records and back to the ability to raise funding, culture of informality, which I won't go into now, a lack of role models, which relates to the celebrate segment of the ecosystem. So a lot of the stories that are being told about entrepreneurs at the moment tend to be these, in quotation marks, get rich quick stories about the guy that started with 5 chickens in 2005, and now he's got 5,000 chickens and he's made it. And along the way, he had some challenges, but we don't really go into what those challenges are. So the general understanding of what it takes to be a successful entrepreneur in Uganda is not really conveyed or built. Okay, so I've flown through those. There's a lot more detail in the report. And what I'd like to do now is just give you a snapshot of the types of recommendations that we made. So for each of these interrelated binding constraints, we recommended a broad action pathway. And I'm not going to go through all of them. They're all in the report. So inside these action pathways, in each of them, there are several proposed activities that tackle different parts of that particular constraint. And these solutions or recommendations fall within a number of different ecosystem domains. So, but just to give you a snapshot, I wanted to briefly talk about the top 5 priority actions that we recommend in the report. So the first is to incentivize and enable commercial banks and microfinance institutions to scale up appropriate financial instruments for moderate growth, SGBs. So like I was saying before, these lower growth SGBs excuse me, might not be attractive enough for investors, but there's a lot more that can be done in terms of testing and scaling up alternative financial products like leasing and factoring and supply chain finance models, etc. And the financial institutions tend to be taking a rather defensive attitude towards small businesses because they are perceived as so risky and all the other factors I mentioned. So interventions in this space could help to push financial institutions into that space to test and scale up successful models. The second is to facilitate the establishment and/or market entry of new SGB funds, investing especially below $300,000. This is the big gap in the market that we got from all the stakeholders we talked to. And this it could be about technical assistance, it could be about guarantee schemes to buy down some of the risk, it could be about helping these new funds to identify potential businesses, potential investees, etc. So there's more detail on that. The third is to set up or scale up BDS subsidy or grant funds, especially looking at strengthening the integration between BDS and finance. So like I said, those BDS suppliers that are serving the smaller brackets, the smaller size of firms, tend to be using some kind of grant funding. And so more grant funding will help to fill that space because there is still a lot of unmet demand. These small businesses simply often don't have the ability or the willingness to pay for good BDS. And again, it's difficult to amortize the cost of it through returns because these SGBs are so risky. So the better there's a link in terms of incentives between BDS and finance, the more this BDS will be quality and will be focused on actually seeing firm growth rather than just, for example, ticking off a box of number of firms trained in a workshop. Fourth is strengthening evidence-based discourse on SME tax regime. So we think, and based on our conversations with various stakeholders, including with the Revenue Authority, we think there's a lot of work that can be done in understanding the implications of tax reform. So if there were to be tax reform that would ease the burden on SMEs, for example, tax holidays or a higher threshold where tax starts to get collected on profits, what would the effect of that reform be? Would it, in the medium run, actually increase job creation, firm growth, and to the benefit of the government itself, tax collection as a result of larger businesses? And the final one we wanted to mention is, I didn't mention this before, so most university courses on business management and entrepreneurship are not using local business cases to train their students. So, you know, as a Ugandan student, learning about business growth, business strategy, using the example of Facebook is not particularly instructive. It would be much more helpful to have strong and truthful local cases of what it takes to run and grow a business in Uganda. So developing a portfolio of those business cases is one of the recommendations. Okay, I'll hand over to Ronald and we'll be happy to take any questions later on.
All right. So I think Max has taken us through Kampala.
Ronald?
Yes?
Yes. One quick clarification. BDS stands for Business Development Services. So thank you. You can continue.
Super. Yes. So now I want to just briefly run through Gulu. Gulu is in the northern part of Uganda, and it is you'd say the economic capital of the northern part of Uganda, and it is a city which is located in a place which has had a history of conflict. So it has some unique findings which actually are born in where the city is located. Now, as Max mentioned, we noted that the SGBs in Gulu are no different from the ones in Kampala in terms of the entrepreneurs are a bit older, they're a bit more experienced, they generally have a higher level of education. You see 60% have a university degree and even, or at least a certificate. And they are also predominantly in trade and hospitality. Now, the trade here is also tied into agriculture because we categorize businesses which are trading in produce as trade businesses and not agriculture businesses. But most of the trade is actually agro-based trade. But largely, these are categories where the businesses are operating. And we also observed when we looked at the specific enterprises and where they fall on this is quite similar to what is happening in Kampala. However, what I want to highlight here is that the majority of SGBs in Gulu are much smaller than the SGBs in Kampala. So if you actually look at the lower scale, you notice that the majority of them are much smaller than the SGBs we saw in Kampala. However, the behavior is the same. We see that there are high growth enterprises which are small, which have a small turnover, and then those which have a kind of a relatively lower turnover, say about 30%. Now, when we look at the snapshot of Gulu, one thing which is different in Gulu is that some of the networks which are taken for granted in Kampala, for example, when you talk about training and connect and sustain, the organizations which support entrepreneurs to be able to network and be able to get opportunities, to be able to link to markets, we find that that is not as, there is still a problem there. So if you look at the farm survey, you quickly notice that the train and connect and sustain are both in red, which wasn't true in Kampala. So this actually points to the challenges which I'm going to mention in a moment. You'll notice that Gulu suffers a bit more in terms of which organizations are present to at least even give basic business development services to the small and growing businesses. Then we look at the key strengths and the top strengths and the top weaknesses. They're quite similar actually. Both believe Gulu enjoys quite a large market, and also Gulu is strategically located close to South Sudan, and that's another very vibrant potential market. The conflict in South Sudan had slowed it down a bit, but actually it is starting to pick up again. But when we look at the weaknesses, we notice that in as much as tax administration and tax rates are still a challenge, this was top in both Kampala and Gulu. Gulu faces specific, what you'd call infrastructure challenges. For example, the businesses which we interviewed in Gulu, they said if I'm running a maize mill, for example, and power is off for half the day, I can't be able to compete. So we actually noticed that the millers in Gulu, where the maize is actually produced, actually are not as competitive as millers in Kampala. And the real thing which is differentiating the two businesses is the stability and the availability of electricity, and also the road network. It's improving. There have been a couple of improvements in the road network. However, this still remains a challenge. So these became the top weaknesses in Gulu. Now, when we look at the binding constraints, I think Max has talked about the records and the informality and the tax, that vicious cycle. That is still the same in Gulu. He has talked about the management skills and practices. But I think one of the challenges in Gulu is that there is a general lack of competitiveness for the SGBs. And this is kind of caused by a cocktail of reasons, ranging from the regional instability, the physical infrastructure, the legacy of war which persists as the district recovers. So you find that a number of entrepreneurs are not as competitive as SGBs in other locations. And definitely also the question of trust and social capital. And this possibly was partly destroyed by the conflict which existed in the region. However, I think when we look at the Gulu SGBs, we notice that even things which are taken for granted, like the availability of training, the availability of business development services in Kampala, some of those don't exist for SGBs. And definitely also the lack of role models. Which role models can we build on to be able to grow grow and encourage and kind of propel the entrepreneurial ecosystem to grow. So those role models are absent. So in terms of, I'll just quickly go to the final slide. In terms of the priority activities, one of the things which we felt from the discussions with the stakeholders is kind of finding more of a center of gravity for SGBs. First of all, to look at these SGBs as enterprises which need specific support. So you find that they don't, since they are missing out in micro, and there is a lot of work which is being done with micro entrepreneurs, micro and small entrepreneurs in the northern part of the country. However, the SGBs are lost. So kind of finding an integrated service provider who can be able to service SGBs would be something which, and we are looking at on which platform we can, and those are discussions which are ongoing. Where can this be built? Should it be based in Gulu University, which is one of the biggest universities in the region? Is there another player who can be able to take this position? But ultimately, you need someone who consolidates a center of gravity for the ecosystem. Then also facilitating market opportunity discovery for local entrepreneurs. Most of the entrepreneurs, the level of exposure, the level of ability to be able to see and seize those opportunities is still lacking. So there needs to be deliberate support, and this could range from exchange visits, from training, from exposure. All this has to happen, and players have to make sure that they're doing this for specifically the SGB so that they can be able to grow and expand their businesses. Then the question of integrating both the incubator business and agronomic advisory services. And this is an important thing, specifically for the small and growing businesses. How do we make sure that these businesses, many of which are actually operating in agro-produce or along the agriculture value chains, how do we make sure that they have a place where they can get full advisory services, both business and agronomical skills? And then we also see that there is a need to also increase the capacity of the business advisory service providers. So we need more of those consultants, we need more of those organizations which give proper business advice to the small and growing businesses. The majority of the ones who currently exist they service more of the small and micro businesses. And lastly, I think most and quite importantly, is to strengthen business associations. There is we talked to the Chamber of Commerce in Gulu, and as an institution, it is not yet doing what it is supposed to do. It's not advocating for the entrepreneurs. It's not helping the entrepreneurs to tap into opportunities that exist. So there has to be a deliberate effort to strengthen these associations. We noticed the leadership of the association hadn't changed for over 15 years. And this association is supposed to service entrepreneurs. They don't feel represented. So we notice most of the business associations that exist actually very weak, and strengthening them could be able to build the trust and be able to improve the Gulu entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I think that's briefly what we had. I will hand back to Max and possibly we'll receive a couple of questions.
Thank you, Ronald.
And thank you.
Yes, Katuchi.
So thank you so much, Max and Ronald, for sharing the findings. And we've been receiving a couple of questions, but because of time, I will just read the two questions. One question for you, Max, and one question for you, Ronald. So for the question that is targeted at Max, did you find different constraints for different types of companies? And what type of companies tended to be high growth versus moderate growth? And this is when you think about, like, a lot of the companies were either in manufacturing and trade. So which ones were high growth and which ones were moderate growth? And then to Ronald's question, we would want to know what was the most surprising finding for you as a practitioner operating in Uganda?
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm afraid to say that I don't have a good response to that question. We don't actually have the data on which sectors were higher growth than lower growth. I mean, I should have said at the start that the whole entrepreneurship ecosystem approach, I think it's one way of tackling the issue, and it needs to be complemented by sector-specific approaches. I think what our mandate was, what we tried to do, was to understand at a relatively high level the ecosystem in which all entrepreneurs operate. Now, obviously, each small and growing business faces some constraints that are general to the type of, the size of the business, and some that are specific to the sector they're in. That's not something that we disaggregated very extensively, but obviously we did find some interesting differences. So when we spoke to manufacturing firms, one of the things that is maybe not so much of a constraint to other firms is access to workspace, access to facilities, to storage, warehouse, to machinery. And the Uganda Investment Authority and the industrial parks have some interesting initiatives, but I think they're probably not reaching the smaller manufacturing firms yet. Ronald?
Yeah.
Maybe do you have something to add to that one as well?
Yeah, I think as Max has said, we didn't set out to be able to disaggregate it, but I think from the interaction we have with the entrepreneurs, we possibly need to increase the sample space a bit to be very sure how to be able to answer that specific question, which are high growth, which are moderate. But because when you find some are in trade and they're high growth, some are not, and so I think as Max has said, we have to do some more digging to be able to answer the sector questions and possibly be able to highlight exactly where high growth is and where moderate is. But to the question of as a practitioner, what was most surprising, I think personally there is something as an organization which we have known for a while. One of the biggest struggles in the work which we do is how do you deliver services to a small and growing business? Because many times the small and growing business is left out by design. So for example, if you design a project and you say it is for youth, the moment you say the project is for people who are below 30, it actually means that you have left out the majority of the small and growing businesses. I think for us as an organization, that's something which came to light, that possibly the true definition of a small and growing business, we need to change a few of the parameters which we are using to define it. And if we go out searching, these small and growing businesses need services. Most of them, they don't fit even in the existing business development services. They are sometimes a bit too big for the current business development services that exist. But then again, they can't afford PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, to be able to service and give them service. So they're kind of lost in between. They are too big for the existing services and too small for what you'd call the commercial services. So I feel that focus on the small and growing business and trying to pull out what a small and growing business is in Uganda was, for me, one of the key revelations. And I hope that all of us as practitioners, we can be able to actually have that at the back of our mind, that chances are if you don't help fully define what a small and growing business is, you can totally leave it out of your interventions.
Thank you so much, Ronald and Max, for your feedback on that. I see a couple of questions. Unfortunately, because of time, we may not be able to get into some of those questions, but I like some of the suggestions that I'm seeing on the text box around like government and private sector foundation, putting money together to finance a big data technology to profile all entrepreneurial projects so that startups can have access to this kind of information. We are seeing all that. And just to point out is that this presentation is just a snapshot of the entire report. We are, after this, actually, you will be able to access the Uganda Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Initiative Phase 1 report on our website. Go through it. If you have any questions around this, feel free to ask us to connect you directly to the consultants, or even to just reach out directly to Andy, and we can answer some of the questions that you have. But beyond that, because we have very limited time, I wanted to talk a little bit about UEI Phase 2 and Max, can you kindly pass me back the screen?
Yes, I will do my best. Hang on. There we go.
Yes, so and with regards to that, I just wanted to highlight that for us at Andy, when we think about UEI Phase 2, we are thinking about it in two phases as well. We are thinking about a UEI Phase 2A, which will be a largely interim and planning phase, and UEI Phase 2B, which will be the implementation phase. And just to point out is that UEI Phase 2A has already commenced, and for us, through this phase, we are actually hoping, or we plan to work or leverage experts to help us think through two things. The first one is to move some of those action pathways or most of the action pathways that were recommended during UEI Phase 1, to move them from just being broad action pathways to very specific activities. So thinking about a theory of change. But beyond that, we are also thinking about a delivery mechanism. And just like we had highlighted at the beginning, that we believe that entrepreneurship programs that tend to be the most effective are those ones that take an ecosystem approach in their design and implementation. We are hoping to be able to think through a delivery mechanism that will take a very ecosystem approach. And to be honest, one of the things that we also wanted to be very open about is that one of our biggest challenge is that we hope to address in this Phase 2A is structuring a Phase 2B from a collective impact perspective, and that is still our biggest struggle. But we are hoping to overcome that in due time. And then in terms of Phase 2B, as I said, Phase 2 is going to be a largely implementation phase. And for us, our vision for Phase 2B is that it's going to be a multi-year, multi-million, multi-stakeholder initiative that will comprehensively address most of the binding constraints that were identified through UEI Phase 1. We are also hoping that it will be very locally driven, with a very huge bias towards strengthening existing initiatives as opposed to building new ones. We are also hoping that UEI Phase 2 will adopt a very iterative design that will allow the implementing team to adjust programming to accommodate ecosystem level shifts. And finally, we are hoping that this phase will have a coordinating, a convening, as well as a funding function. So if you're in this call, there are still many ways in which you can partner with us in Phase 2. So if you are an implementer and you have key insights on lessons learned from implementing an intervention that takes a very collaborative approach, feel free to reach out to us. I will provide the contacts of the project leads for Uganda Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Initiative. Feel free to reach out to us and share those insights. If you're a funder and you're interested in coming on board and being a part of Phase 2B, feel free to reach out to us and see how you can start participating in Phase 2A as a way of helping, or as a way of co-creating how Phase 2B will look like. And at this point in time, before we wind up, we wanted to just say a huge thank you to all of you for joining the call. We also wanted to say a huge thank you to the consultants for working with us through this project, and also for just being present to facilitate this session. We also wanted to thank you all the partners that were involved in designing this, all the funders that funded Phase 1A, and finally all the stakeholders that shared with us their insights about the Uganda entrepreneurial ecosystem. So thank you. We've seen a lot of questions in terms of, will this webinar recording be availed? Will the report be available? Yes. So the webinar recording will go live, I think, from around 5:30 East Africa time, or 9:30 a.m. EST. So feel free to go through that and check it out and probably re-listen to some of the things that were not very clear to you. And then we will also share a link to this with all the attendees that participated. So without much further ado, I'd like to just say thank you for those that are in East Africa or Africa. Have an amazing evening. And for those that are in the US and Europe, have a great day ahead. So thank you.
Katuchi, thank you very much to you and all the funders as well. and everyone for listening. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you have any questions.
Thank you. Bye. Done. Sasa hii ni consult